I already realized quite what time it was. Over here running my mouth. Welcome everybody to our services tonight. We're going to be in 3 John tonight, finishing up our study of John's epistles. We'll take a minute, excuse me, and do prayer requests. I'll let Craig and Sheila kind of tell you what went on with Jacob. They can tell that better than I can, so we can be sure to be praying for him. Craig?
Yeah, Friday night, caught a pass, went to cut.
We're going to be in 3 John tonight. It's, again, it is a one sermon for this little book here. 3 John is interesting because it's one of those rare epistles that is a personal epistle. Not unlike 2 John, where we're not 100% sure whether he's talking to a lady in the church with the family or whether he's talking to the church and he calls that church a lady. We're certain that 3 John is written by the Apostle John to an individual. But in doing that to the individual, they also send it to the church. Like many things, that's kind of how this letter is written. If you're familiar with what our study's been so far on the letters of John, you know, 1 John is not a big book in the sense of Romans or Hebrews or something like that, but it's a really rich book. You know, you got 5 chapters. It's really all about the Christian life. And it's just a really amazing little book. One of my favorites of all the smaller books in the New Testament. 2 John is about warning the church and dealing with apostasy and false teachers in the church and all that sort of thing. Well, 3 John is a little different. 3 John is talking about problems in the church. In particular, problems in an unnamed church. Unlike Ephesus or Corinth or something like this, this letter didn't pick up the name of the church that it was written to. You know, it's not like when Paul wrote Ephesians, he said, we're going to call this book Ephesians. It picked up that name because everyone knew who the letter was originally circulated to. But in this particular book, this little small book, and when John writes it, I'm warning you now, I'm probably going to say Paul writes it because that's been wanting to come out of my mouth throughout this whole study. So if I say that, y'all just go, back up. John wrote it to an individual to address some issues that were going on in this church. And just in the course of the letter, he never tells us the name of the church in particular that he's dealing with. So all we know is it's a New Testament church during the time of John, and we know the names of 3 individuals who were in that church. And really this letter is kind of centers around the 3 different personalities, the 3 different workings of these people in this unknown church. So it's a unique book. It's different in many ways than anything else that you see in the New Testament. I really wouldn't say there's any other book compares except maybe 2 John. And even then, it's still quite different. So if you're familiar with the book, there are 3 primary people who are addressed in the book. There is a man named Gaius, there is a man named Diotrephes, and there is a man named Demetrius. These 3 individuals are the people who are either addressed directly or spoken of indirectly. And in doing so, we kind of get an idea of what was going on in the church. Let me give you a little bit of background. John had sent some preachers to the area. In coming through that area, he was dependent upon the local churches to help and support and minister to these traveling preachers as they came through the area. But in doing that, John discovered that some people were loving and Christ-like and did the work that God has called them to do in supporting these men of God. Others were diametrically opposed to the work that was going on. They didn't want these men welcomed into the church. They didn't want them to be supported or helped in any way. And that's kind of the central conflict. It's not one of those deals where you necessarily have 2 parties at war with one another. But you've got a good man in the church in Gaius, who John commends. You've got a wicked man in Diotrephes, which is condemned pretty soundly. And then we almost like a tack on at the end. John mentions another man that is influential and helpful in the church, and he's basically given props for that. He's spoken of in a very positive way. So 3 John's a little bit different. It's going to take us in a little bit different direction. We're going to start off, as always, in verse 1. Sometimes you think, well, let's just get past the greeting because there's no meat on the bone when you get to the greeting. Well, sometimes there is. Sometimes there's little nuggets here, even in the greeting, when it just seems real inconsequential, because little things sometimes can give you a little bit of insight into the book. And I think that's the case here. We see again the use of the term the elder. John refers himself to that. This was written later on in his life, We don't know precisely when. There's no real way to date 2 John or 3 John. Pretty much most people think it took place in the 90s AD. And then in and around the same time of 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, Revelation, all there together towards the end of the ministry. It's towards the closing of the New Testament canon. And so we don't know 100% for sure, but it's basically in that same basic time frame that the other written works of John take place, with the exception of the Gospel of John. Most people think the Gospel of John was a little bit earlier than the rest of these books. But, you know, dating of the books is really kind of a crapshoot. We can kind of guess sometimes, but it's usually not based on a lot of hard facts. There's no original copy of 3 John floating around that they can test the papists and go, wow, that was 87 AD. There's no way to do that. A lot of folks don't realize it, but I think the oldest manuscript in existence was still 300 years after the original Bible was written. So what we're dealing with are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. And so most of it's based on church history. It's based on letters that were written by other late Christian believers. For example, if a man we know lived in 200 AD mentions this book, he might give something in his writings that give us an idea when the book was written. But for the most part, we don't know 100% sure when this stuff was written. All we can do is kind of go on best case scenario. So he says, the elder, this is John, towards the end of his life, unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. Now that's a pretty atypical greeting in the New Testament. On the surface, it might not seem like there's a whole lot there to look at, but there are some interesting things I think that you can draw from that. Go back to the expression, the well-beloved Gaius. In the Greek, it's written more like a title. For example, you've heard of Alexander the Great. Well, his name was Alexander, and the Great is something that he became known as because he was considered to be a great king of his era and of his time, a great conqueror. Alfred was a king in England, and he got the title Alfred the Great. Well, the way the Greek is written, it's not the well-beloved Gaius. That's kind of how the King James guys put it in order. It is Gaius the well-beloved. And it kind of matters if you understand how Greek works, because it's a pretty significant thing that John would tack that title on at the end. He was really giving him something significant. A Greek reader would have taken that as a pretty significant statement, whereas you and I might just kind of blow past it and not give a lot of credence or significance to it. The word there for well-beloved means he is worthy of love. Gaius is a significant factor in this church. Doesn't mean he's a powerful leader. Doesn't mean he's necessarily a pastor or a deacon or anything. But his spiritual presence in the church is significant because he was going about the work of the Lord even though they were being opposed by other people in the church, particularly the guy we're going to get to next. So him calling himself Gaius the well-beloved or the beloved is a pretty significant little statement there. Notice what he says to him initially. He says, first of all, whom I love in the truth. Whom I love in the truth. And that statement is actually used, I believe it's in 2 John once or twice. It's phrased a little different, but used in the Gospel of John as well. Basically what that statement means is I love you in the highest sphere. I don't just love you as a family member, if you were my family. I don't just love you because we go to the same church. I don't just love you because, well, you know, Greg's my neighbor necessarily. He's not my neighbor, but for the sake of argument. I don't just love him because we like the same sports team. He says, the love that I have for you is based in the truth. And that expression is often used to speak of salvation in itself, being in the truth. And so John is saying, man, the relationship, the love I have for you guys, me giving you this title, the well-beloved, is based upon the fact that our love exists in the highest sphere that man can know. And that's in the truth of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. So even in the simple greeting, y'all, there's little things that can give us insight. Go to verse 2. He said, beloved, same root word as the well-beloved above. Beloved, I wish above all things. What's his prayer for Gaius? That thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. Even as thy soul prospereth. Now that's an interesting thing to write. First of all, he's saying, you know, you've got two things that I'm addressing here. Basically your work, which we don't know if that's his secular work or ministry work, because we don't really know who Gaius is. He's saying, man, I want your work to prosper. He says, I want your health to prosper, but by what standard, by what measure? What is he saying? height or level does he hope it to attain to? He says, I hope that your business, your work, and that your health prospers to the same degree that your soul has prospered. So what is he really saying there? He's like, guys, you are held in the highest esteem in my eyes. Gaius has done something, and we're about to be introduced to it here in a moment, that John finds truly significant. And when you understand the context, the world in which he did it, the circumstances, the church in which he did it, you'll understand he risked a lot to do it. There was a challenge given to this local congregation. We don't know if it was a big church or a little church. We don't know if this was a little fish in a little pond or a big fish in a big pond. We're not really privy to any of that. But Gaius took a lot of risk in being obedient to the Lord. There are men who are traveling, and y'all got to understand, there's no Motel 6. There's no organized missions work in the same way we have conventions and associations and things like that. When ministers traveled, their livelihoods were dependent upon the churches and believers who hosted them. It's not a real common thing anymore for the pastor to be invited to Sunday supper. Now, I'm okay with that should anyone wish to revive it. I've had some pretty good throwdown meals early on, you know. Those seniors in my first church, they were of that generation where you invite the preacher to Sunday supper. Oh my gosh, did we have some meals around the table. But it's a bit of a lost thing. Our culture is different. More likely Kenny's going to say, hey man, let's go to Yoli's. And I'm going, let's go. We'll go get something to eat. Nobody's got to wash dishes, and we still have a good time. And I'm okay with that. Okay? But the idea of hosting someone in your home, especially someone who's a stranger, is not really a part of our culture today. But y'all know we talked about this a great deal early on in some other studies. Being a host in a biblical context, in the time of the Bible, being willing to take a stranger into your home to make sure that they're fed and clothed. And you know, we've studied this in a couple of different contexts in the books. Remember the story of Lot and his daughters and the strangers that came into his home. That story horrifies us. But if you put it in a Middle Eastern context, to entertain strangers, that was one of the highest callings you had in a Middle Eastern culture. So let's just use Miriam for example here. She's a member of the same church as Gaius is, and she hears that the Apostle John, this is the last living apostle, significant individual, it has some of his ministers coming through. Miriam would have considered it to be her absolute obligation to ensure that they have a roof over their head and food on their table, money in their purse if she's able to give that, giving them the clothing, whatever they needed to ensure that their journey continued. There were no other resources. You know, you couldn't just go to Walmart and wire $500 from the denomination because they've had a crisis. You know, because their mule dies and they have nothing to transport their work with or whatever. So Miriam would have taken this as a deeply held obligation to God, to be a minister to God's ministers. And that's kind of where Gaius finds himself. So John is throwing out the superlatives. John is really, John's not schmoozing people. He's being sincere. This is the word of God. What he writes is truth. Gaius has to be held in really high esteem because you'll understand here in a moment what Gaius risked. Why it was so significant. Okay? So he's throwing out all of these really flowing superlatives. He goes, man, I hope that your health and your work prospers as well as your soul has, because what I'm really saying is you're an amazing Christian. Basically, that's what Gaius is having said of him. He's in great spiritual health, and he has a great testimony about him. Let's look at his testimony. You ready? Verse 3. For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in the truth. You hear this expression here, his children. Y'all know he's not saying this in a literal sense. Gaius was not his child. They were his spiritual offspring. Paul used the same expression a number of times in his letters. Those, when he'd come into a city and preach the gospel, people would come to Christ. He would organize a New Testament church. He would ordain leaders, and he would go to the next place. He's a church planter. So we call him today as a missionary, but a church planter. And many times he would talk about his children in the truth, or his children. And John considers this community, whichever one it is, to be his children, his spiritual offspring. And so he's celebrating this great thing. He's celebrating this great report. But what happened here? It's an interesting little thing here about this expression in verse 3. He says, "For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came." The Greek has an interesting little spin on that word "came." It's not speaking of a single instance. John didn't get just one old good report on Gaius, and now he thinks Gaius is the greatest thing since sliced bread. The Greek gives a slightly different connotation there. It literally means the coming repeatedly of messengers. They came all right, but they came once and again and again and again. And guess what John's hearing every time someone comes from this community, comes from this church, comes from this area? Gaius is faithful to the Lord. Gaius loves Jesus. Gaius is faithful no matter the consequences. Gaius is willing to risk it all to be faithful. Gaius, Gaius, Gaius. That's a significant thing. Interesting, as I was just going over my notes and getting ready tonight, I thought, I wonder what would be written about us if John sent through his ministers and they spent time in our church. What would be the report? Interesting. I just had that thought come through my mind. You know, we don't often think of it in this context, but it was just a church like Hillcrest. Maybe bigger, maybe smaller, maybe richer, maybe poorer. But John sent through the ministers, and they had a responsibility to the Lord to minister to them and to love them and to support and care for them. And I would be curious to know what those ministers would say about their time at Hillcrest. Put that into your context just a little bit when you read a little book like this. So they didn't just come one time. This is an ongoing thing. What are they hearing? He says, the truth that's in thee. They heard, first of all, Gaius is a saved man. If the truth is in you, that means you're saved. Because the Bible says when a person is not truly saved, it says the truth isn't in them. He uses that exact expression. So for John, it says, John, the truth is in him. First report that he's receiving of Gaius is that Gaius is the real deal. Now let's just be honest. We got churches filled with unsaved people today. There were churches filled with unsaved people then. And so what you want to know, we don't have the luxury. They didn't have the luxury of the internet and cell phones and the contact that we have. The only report they get. Who's in this church today? You know, let's just say Craig was the traveling missionary and he goes back to report to John, and John says, well, tell me about the church. He goes, well, I met a brother named Joe, and I met his wife, and, you know, I really think that they love the Lord. They have a great reputation among the people. And so John goes, all right, Joe, I'm glad to know that Joe's really loving the Lord. And he says, well, I met a man named Greg, and, you know, Greg was always willing to get in there and get dirty and get his hands dirty, and, you know, that's all the report that they had. They didn't know anything else. And so this is what's coming. So the first thing is he's getting multiple reports. And all the reports have one thing to say. First of all, he's a saved man. That's a Christian. Gaius is really and truly a Christian. Not only that, he says, for I rejoice greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. Not only is he giving the evidence that he's a real deal, that he's truly a Christian, he is also giving evidence that he lives a walk that's consistent with being a Christian. Now, here's the deal. I've known a lot of people that I truly believe that they're believers, but their life is not always consistent with that. Now, I'm not their judge and jury. I don't sit there and go, well, Yvonne, I tell you what, she's just really not living up to her calling. That's not what I do, but we all get our impressions, do we not? Some of y'all have been in church as long as I've been alive. You've seen a lot of people in church. You might not have a reason to question someone's salvation, but you might have a reason to question their walk with God because you've seen it. We all have those hallmark moments, right? So, he says, not only is this a saved man, this is a saved man whose life is consistent with the truth. He says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in the truth. He is rejoicing. He is celebrating. Interesting, one little nugget. I had it jotted down here. Let me find my spot. I think it may be in verse 5. There it is. Yes, in verse 5, actually. It says, beloved, thou dost faithfully whatsoever thou dost to the brethren and to strangers. Greek has an interesting little tidbit here with the word thou. The word thou there is emphatic. And we don't use the word thou and thy. We use you and your. A lot of folks don't realize it, but did you know when the King James was written, they didn't use thou and thy in everyday language either. A lot of folks think, well, that's just how they talked in 1611. No, they didn't. It was used in formal circumstances and in like courtly language around the king and some things like that. But in day-to-day, guess what Miriam said? You and your, just like you and me. So why did they put thou and thy in the book? Why did they translate the King James and put thou and thy? Because in most circumstances, you and your were plural, and thou and thy were singular. Guess which is more accurate when you pick up your Bibles, your versions of the Bible? King James is. The thou there is singular. For example, your car is on fire. Now, whose car is on fire? I said yours is. Tony, why aren't you getting up and checking your car? Miriam, why aren't you out there checking on your truck? I just said your vehicle's on fire. You don't know who I'm talking to. But if I say your car is on fire, I'm being emphatic, first of all. So that's why the King James says thou and thy. It's not because it's just how they talked in 1611. That was already faded out of the English language primarily. It's because it was very specifically translated so you would know, am I dealing with a singular pronoun in the Greek, or am I dealing with a plural pronoun in the Greek? When you see you and your, almost universally, it is a plural pronoun. God is speaking to a group. Sometimes he would use the you, plural, and speak to an individual, but we know when he says thou and thy, he's talking to an individual. It's specific. So add that. We have a very specific language here. That's just a tidbit about the King James. It's why it's that way. I know it gets hard to read sometimes. I'm going to be the first one to tell you that. But he didn't just say thou specifically singular. He uses it in what's called an emphatic voice. John is making sure the reader knows one person gets this praise. He's not speaking to a group of individuals. He is singling him out. Beloved, thou dost faithfully. He's not giving that praise to anybody else in that church. It's an emphatic statement. Just like if I'm saying you don't know what I'm talking about. But if I stare you down and say, you, Thomas, your car's on fire. Hope nobody's car catches on fire tonight. Because police are going to have questions. You're going to know it's emphatic. You know who I'm talking to. You know what I'm talking about. And emphatically he declares, you are faithful in whatever you doest. Now, we say doest. Why did I say that? Why do you think I say dust? Because that's how it's pronounced. When you say the word does, do you say do as? No, he does go to work on Monday morning, even though he's tired. You don't say do as. Well, it's not do as either. It's dust. So, what does he say? Beloved, thou dost faithfully whatsoever thou dost to the brethren and to strangers. Now we're beginning to find out what's going on in this church. Why is Gaius so praised in this book? Now I know it may seem strange that I'm dwelling on this unknown person, Gaius, but God thought it significant enough to write a book about it. Of all the people in the New Testament age that God could have written about, he's writing about a man named Gaius. He inspired the Apostle John to write a little bitty letter about an insignificant person in the eyes of the world. In a church so insignificant it didn't even get a name, so we would know about it. That's how significant it is. Every part of the Bible is important. So what does he say? He's faithful in what? Both in what his ministry is. He does to the brethren and to strangers. Gaius is known as a man who lives and practices what he preaches. And the thing that's significantly in play now is ministry to other people. Ministry to those who are in the church, that's the brethren, specifically visiting preachers and missionaries. And those outside the church, those are the lost, that the church ministered to at different times and different occasions. Gaius was known by a man who lived his faith. Everybody with me on that? Everybody understand the significance of it? All right. Go to verse 6. He's faithful in these things which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. And that gets a little wordy there. What's he talking about? Slow down. Go through verse 6 again. His ministry, his faithfulness hath borne witness of the charity. That's the word love, charis. It's the same word we translate love in 1 Corinthians 13. Before the church, whom, if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. So what is he talking about in verse 6? He is willing to minister to those in need, both the stranger and the brethren. Both the stranger and the brethren. What's he talking about there? I want to break that down here just a little bit. Why is God praising this ministry? There's three things we're going to pull out of this text right here. Why he chooses to praise Gaius. First of all, he uses the expression, a godly sort. His ministry is worthy of God. His ministry is worthy of the Lord. Not saying that Gaius is perfect or sinless or without fault or without fail, but what he's saying is the kind of ministry he's faithful to is worthy of God. That exact expression there means appropriate to a deity. Appropriate to a deity is a generic statement for God. It doesn't use God's name there like Jehovah or anything like that. So he says, first of all, it's appropriate. It's of a godly sort. Notice what he says next in verse 7. Because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. I guarantee you that breaker has blown out there again. That's why it's so warm in here tonight. So we got to get that figured out now, because it just keeps blowing. It was blowing fine earlier, but breaker's blowing. That's why it's gotten so warm in here. Because for his name's sake, verse 7, they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles. What happened? John sent these men through this area, counting on the church to support them and love them and see them on their way. And when they came, because of the ministry of Gaius, they didn't have to go to any Gentiles to ask for help. Understand that there were ministries amongst the Gentiles too. There were ministry amongst the temples. You could go to the temple of Aphrodite, and I would imagine they would give you food and bread and whatever you need to go on your journey. Those things were not inherently unique to the Christian church. But he said because of Gaius, they didn't have to go to the Gentiles and beg help. So what does that imply? That probably happened in some places. Men of God would not necessarily go to the temple of Aphrodite. I don't know that they would do that, but they would have to go amongst the Gentiles begging bread, begging support, begging a place to stay. They were still in the Middle Eastern culture. Even a Gentile probably would have taken you in because that's just what they were taught to do. But in the circumstances of Gaius and his church and his community, none of these men had to go to a Gentile begging bread. What does that tell a Gentile? Listen, there's good folks that are lost as a goose. I'll guarantee you can knock on Uncle Randy's door right now and ask him, he'll give you a shirt off his back. He's not going to let you go away hungry, but he's running from God. I don't think he's saved, but not a bad man. Good man. Better man than most Christian men I know, truth be known. So, but because of Gaius, in this instance, they didn't have to get a bad reputation. How is it that Christians have to go outside the church to find help? If we're not willing to love and care for our own, what does that tell the world? Well, Gaius, his reputation, his ministry, his faithfulness gave testimony because none of these men had to go anywhere else, taking nothing of the Gentiles. Look at verse 8. We therefore ought to receive such that we might be fellow helpers to the truth. He said that's exactly how it ought to be done. We ought to be helping along the truth by supporting the men of God. Not just missions money. Whatever the need is amongst the men of God, it ought to be met with the church. And I think that's a pretty good principle right there. And if that was the only thing we had in this whole book, God closes it out and said, man, guys, you're a great guy. Thanks so much for everything you did. Hope to see you soon when I visit. We would still think that's a pretty cool little letter. But we're about to get some context. Why is it so significant that Gaius ministered to the men of God? Why is it so significant? It's because of the man found right there in verse 9, Diotrephes. Gaius was an encourager. He was the beloved. Diotrephes was a dictator and a bully in the church. Known any of those through the years? Known a couple. He was a dictator and a bully. And so he doesn't get this lovely flowing introduction from the Apostle John. Look what it says in verse 9. I wrote unto the church. John didn't just write Gaius. He wrote a letter to the church. Now what did he write in that letter? I'm sending men through there. They are men of God. They are ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I ask you to do everything in your power to minister to them and to care for them as I know you want to do because you're believers. Sounds like a missions introduction letter, doesn't it? He wrote to the church, but what happened? How come all of it fell on Gaius? Because there was a dictator in that church, and he intercepted the letter, and he didn't let it go forth. We don't have that letter surviving. It wasn't Scripture. God didn't preserve it. But John wrote a letter. John wrote lots of letters that weren't scripture, y'all. Only certain ones were divinely inspired and kept and brought into the Word of God. But he says, I wrote unto the church. I didn't just write to you guys. I did write a letter to the church. But Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Now, he doesn't directly address the letter, but I think the implication there is the church never saw the letter. I don't know that. But I think that the implication is, the hint is, I wrote a letter, but they never saw it. It got intercepted by the little dictator bully we know as Diotrephes. Okay, so what is the significance about him? We don't know a lot about him, but John does tell us something about him. He says he loves to have the preeminence. What's preeminence? First place. First place. My church. This is my church, and we're going to do it my way. How would y'all like it if I stood up here on Sundays and I said that? Pretty short-lived tenure, I hope. Fire me. This is my church. I told you about a deacon I had one time. Came to church, brand new, just came to this church. Don't know any other church for that except one family. And he comes up to me about my first Sunday, maybe second Sunday. He says, well, Brother Mike, I just want you to know I'm a deacon here, and I give $10,000 a year to the church above and beyond my tithe. Appreciate that, brother. That's wonderful. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, Gerald. Day or two, a week later, well, I just want you to know I give $10,000 a year to the church above and beyond my tithe. He said it again and again and again. And I saw over time that he thought he was the big kahuna, the big cheese. It was his church. He ought to know about everything. He ought to be informed about everything. Everything ought to go through him. And I'm just here to tell you, I'm not a guy that makes waves. I don't yell, kick, scream, but I don't do that. I don't think you'll find anybody in 25 years who will ever say I bullied anything through the church, but at the same time, I don't deal with bullies. My pastor gave me a very strong word of wisdom on my very first church because I had a difficult set of circumstances there as well. I said, what do I do? How do I address that? He said, Micah, you can spend your whole ministry trying to dig out the stumps. He said, you can just plow around it. Let that sink in for just a minute. Someone wants to resist you at every single turn because you're stepping on their territory and interfering with their power base. You can fight them, but for what? 9 times out of 10, preachers are going to lose because the church knows preachers come and go, but deacons are forever. And I use that expression lightly. But that's the mindset, right? The deacons stay for 40 years. Do you want to make the deacon mad? Or do you want to just let the preacher lose and we'll get another? And sadly, that's what happens in churches again and again and again and again. The pastor's not the one that stays, it's the deacon. And that's why deacons rarely ever get confronted about, the problem deacons rarely ever get confronted about the issues that they cause. So I say all that to say, we don't know exactly what role Diotrephes had. I don't know if he's the pastor. I don't know if he's a deacon. I don't know if he was just a powerful member, but he obviously had great influence because you're going to see some things here in just a moment. But Diotrephes loved to have the preeminence, and that's a problem because what Colossians 1:18 says. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things Christ might have the preeminence. It's Christ's job. Because one thing you will never hear me say in a possessive sense or tone, that this is my church. I'll say it's my church and then it's my church, I love it, I'm the pastor of this church. But you will never hear me speak in a possessive tone as if anything here belongs to me. That it's mine to rule or to run. Or those things are never going to come out of my mouth. It's not who I am. It's not how I'm wired. If they do, you need to address it. If I don't change, fire me. But this man liked the preeminence. He was the big fish in the little pond, hypothetically. He was the one who wanted to rule and to reign. And what was he doing? Notice the expression at the end of verse 9. He says, he receiveth us not. Now, John uses the term us because those are his ministers. Those are his men. And they were not received by the church. And arguably, most of the church probably never knew that John recommended them. Because listen, you have to understand the context here. Let's just say you're a member of First Baptist Podunk and some man comes along and says, I work with the Apostle John. I'm one of his ministers, and I'm traveling through, and would you help me and take care of me? And could you possibly take up an offering to help me along my way? How do you know he works with John? You got a phone, you got an internet, pull up the website? Doesn't exist. Only thing you had were letters of introduction. I don't know if they used seals or how they did it, but they would know if a letter that came was a letter truly from John, not just something written in John's name. That's how we Baptists get the habit of doing letters for membership. Other denominations laugh at us. It's scriptural. How else do I know that Craig and Sheila are Christians? How do I know they follow the Lord in baptism? How do I know that they didn't just bust up and drag their last church through an absolute living hell? Because he was the Diotrephes of the church. We don't know that unless what? We receive a letter of recommendation from a sister church. It's why we do what we do. There's reasons. So, Diotrephes, I would imagine most, if not the bulk of the church, had no idea these men were from God. So they don't know. Why? Because the letter was intercepted. And it says Diotrephes, he wouldn't receive us. He wouldn't have us in the church. He wouldn't support us. He wouldn't allow anybody, as a matter of fact. Look what it says in verse 10. Wherefore, based upon what we just heard about Diotrephes, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doth. Prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith. That's not enough for Diotrephes. Neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, that's implied there, receive the brethren, and casteth them out of the church. You got a true dictator in Diotrephes. So let's break down what Diotrephes is guilty of. He says, wherefore if I come, I will remember. That's an interesting word, because when I read that the first time, I will remember him. I pictured John coming in there with like a voice of thunder, and that's not what that word means. It actually means to remind quietly. Isn't that interesting? You read it, I'll remember him. That's kind of how I envisioned it when you read the text. I'm going to set him straight. I'm going to walk in there and thunder from on high and call down fire. And that's not what John says. He goes, I'm going to remind quietly everything that's been done. John wasn't saying when I come. It's implied in the text, John thinks he's going to visit soon. I would have loved to be the fly on the wall for that visit. But even then, he didn't say, I'm coming in there 6 guns a-blazing. I'm going to burn that guy to the ground. He said, I'm going to come and remind quietly everything that I'm about to say, everything that happened. Why do you think it is? And this is pure conjecture. Why do you think he said that? What's always the goal? What's always the goal when there's trouble in the church? Reconciliation. He didn't say, I'm coming to see that Diotrephes is crucified on a cross or burned alive. He said, I'm going to come in and remind quietly everything I know. And he doesn't say it outright. The implication is, because he could have used different expression, he didn't. He said, I'm going to remind quietly everything that I'm about to tell you. I believe it's because the goal is always reconciliation. If we can reconcile as brethren, I don't know Diotrephes' state. He doesn't give evidence of being saved. But if he's not saved, what's the goal? That he'll be saved. The idea wasn't just to burn Diotrephes to the ground. The idea was to set the church back right. To do it right. I just think that's a beautiful little tidbit. Stay with me. Okay, so we're going to remind quietly. What was he doing? He uses an expression, prating against us with malicious words. That word there means, prating, it literally means to babble or to boil over. Diotrephes was a big mouth, throwing out anything that would stick, just word vomit against anybody he opposed. He was a big talker. He was a big accuser. He was a big railer of accusations. But the idea behind the word babbler there means nonsense. Nothing he said was true. But that didn't matter. The Bible says, don't entertain an accusation against an elder unless it's in the mouth of 2 or more witnesses. Why does it say that? Because you can say anything. Say anything you want. I'm just going to use an illustration here that has no basis in fact whatsoever. Let's just say Tony and I are at odds with each other. We don't like each other. We've got bad blood, and I'm trying to push Tony out. Maybe Tony's trying to push me out, and it's one of those circumstances. What if I go to Craig and say, Craig, I saw Tony back there with the offering. Man, He's putting money in his pocket. Now, does that have to have any basis in the truth whatsoever? Y'all know that's not true. It's a totally made up statement. But does it have to have any basis in the truth to stick? Maybe Craig thinks, oh, Micah wouldn't lie to me. Micah's great. My gosh, I can't believe Tony would do that. And I pull Kenny aside and say, man, there's problems with Tony. He's doing this, he's doing that. And I make up all kinds of just total junk. Doesn't matter that there's no truth in it. People will believe things they hear. Think about gossip. Why do you think God warns about gossip, 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 gossip? It's not just because we laugh and joke. It's funny, we laugh and joke at gossip, but gossip destroys lives. That's why God says don't entertain an accusation against an elder unless it's in the mouth of 2 or more witnesses. That's not two or more babblers. That's 2 people with confirmed factual evidence that there's something wrong. They're stealing, they're cheating, or whatever. There's got to be a basis for the accusation. But in the case of Diotrephes, he was a leader and people listened. So he babbled incessantly. Untrue nonsense is what the word means. He goes on to describe it with malicious words. That word there means the words were hurtful, full of pain and trouble. Anyone he opposed, he destroyed. How did he destroy him? With the power of his mouth. He tore him down. So these missionaries come along, and Joe wants to be faithful, and they're taking up an offering. They're going to take him into their home. Well, I'm Diotrephes. You're opposing me, Joe? Well, we'll see about that. And I'm over here, and I'm telling everybody anything they'll listen about Joe and his wife. These guys, they're just opposing God's work, and they're just the enemies of the church, and they're not listening to the leadership. And for too long, what have I done? I've torn them away from the fabric of the church. And that's what Diotrephes did. Malicious words, pain. What are the requirements for a pastor? Think about some of those like in 1 Timothy 3. We can rattle them all off. But you know one of them that doesn't get mentioned very often? Hospitality. It's one of the requirements of a pastor. What's hospitality? It's being a good host, loving a stranger, ministering to those in need. It's one of the requirements of a pastor. I don't know that Diotrephes was a pastor, but he didn't have it. Was he qualified to hold a position of leadership in the church? He didn't have it. Because in fact, not only did he oppose ministering to the disciples of John, the ministers and the missionaries of John, he went after anybody who would. And what did he do? It says, and he casteth them out of the church. That word there means to drive out with violence. He de-churched them. Joe and Kay are going to be faithful until Diotrephes finds out, and he just destroys them and he runs them out of church, and they're out of the fellowship. And unlike our churches, there's not 19 Baptist churches within a half a mile. Most communities had a church, and it met in lots of locations like houses and marketplaces and things like that. So to be de-churched, to be excommunicated, to have fellowship withdrawn from you, most often left a believer with nothing. No one else in that community to be guided by, to be loved by, to fellowship with, and to worship. It's a big deal. This is what Diotrephes was guilty of. So now you get an idea of why Gaius got such high praise. Look at the risk he took. What would have happened to Gaius if Diotrephes would have come after him? And we don't know. Maybe Gaius had enough power base that he was immune to Diotrephes' attacks. We don't know. Maybe he was a pastor himself or a significant member. We don't know. Somehow or another, Gaius was willing to risk that. And there's no evidence in the text that Diotrephes went after him. But do you understand that context? That's why John was saying the beloved, the well-beloved. That's why he was saying your faith, you give testimony to your salvation. He was willing to risk the wrath of a man like Diotrephes when nobody else was. So, really significant in that example. And then almost as an afterthought. Strange ending to the letter. I'll give you that. It's different. He now begins to close out the letter, but he wants to point out not only was Gaius worthy of some praise. Gaius the beloved. You've got Diotrephes the dictator. And then you get a man named Demetrius who's set out as another example of what a person ought to be. He says in verse 11, beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doth good is of God. He that doth evil hath not seen God. So again, he's making a judgment here based upon the evidence. Gaius gives evidence of salvation, therefore we believe him to be a saved man. Diotrephes does not give evidence of salvation, therefore we don't accept him as a saved man. John's not trying to be judge, jury, and executioner. He's saying, here, this is the evidence. And while I'm on that subject, he says, verse 12, Demetrius hath good report of all men. Remember, he's getting multiple reports, not just one. Not only has Gaius been well reported, a man named Demetrius has been well appointed. Some people think Demetrius is one of the men in the New Testament called Demas in other places. Demas is a shortened version of Demetrius. It's like Matt and Matthew, John and Jonathan. Well, Demas is a shortened version of Demetrius. It was a common name, so the other Demases in the scripture, and there's a number of them, some good, some bad. Not necessarily Demetrius, but there's some hint of that in early church writings that they believed him to be one of the other men called Demas in the New Testament. We don't know that. But what about him? Demetrius hath good report of all men, and of the truth itself. Yea, and we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true. He closes out, I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee, but I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to thee, our friends salute thee. Greet the friends by name. One last place, go to 2 Peter chapter 3. We're going to close out. I think the story of 3 John is an interesting letter to me. Not the most famous of letters, not the most significant or impactful. But it's a reminder that everything that happens in a church, the Lord sees. And everything that happens in a church will stand before the light someday. God's going to judge our works. And it reminded me of this text, 2 Peter 3, verse 10, to remind us. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness? Interesting spin in that verse there. Seeing that all this is going to be dissolved, what manner of person ought you to be? And keep in mind, this is written to believers, not. It's easy to say, if as a lost person, you better get right with God, buddy, or you're going to go to hell someday. He says, Christian, you better be right with God, because you're going to stand before the Lord someday. Everything here that we see, touch, feel, smell, it's all going to be gone. And you'll stand before the Lord, and you're going to give an account of what you did. Time, opportunity, and gifts God gave you. Anything else before we dismiss? Don't be a Diotrephes.